why do you need a business case, right? Without a compelling business case, leadership may see Scope 3 emission reductions as only a costs rather than a value driver, which means your progress on reduction will be stalled when trying to meet your ambitions. You might lose competitive advantage. But Scope 3 is one of these abstract things with data that is outside of your control. It's sometimes implicit, the value, which we will come back to a little bit later. So it's a lot more difficult than, let's say, for example, Scope 1 and 2 projects. That was really straightforward. Energy costs surged with the Ukraine war, with dependency on Russian gas, for example. So when you then say, oh, when we invest this much money in solar power, we get this much amount of renewable energy, which reduces our Scope 2 emissions to zero, for example, maybe a little bit of FERA emissions. And that return is very straightforward. We avoid this much CO2 equivalent, but it also pays itself back because we don't have to purchase electricity anymore. Well, that's great that is easily to prove, easy to argument a Scope 1 and 2 business case, but it only represents 5% of your footprint, maybe 10, maybe 15%. But the majority still sits in Scope 3. And the reality is it's much harder to prove ROI of Scope 3 projects because you don't have the data, because it's a bit more nuanced what your money buys you. For example, it may take a couple of years before it is implemented or before it starts showing its results, which is why we are going to focus on it today. Well, so what do I need for a business case? This is the same for sustainability as it is for marketing. I'm a marketing person, so marketing costs money. Argumenting why certain investments or costs need to be made are often done with a business case, especially when it's about very substantial costs to the business. Now, a sensible business case always needs 5 elements, right? Baseline, where today, what is our current carbon? Maybe you did a spend-based analysis, maybe already activity-based for hotspots. Maybe you already have some PCF information, APD information. You have the volumes you purchase from your suppliers. You might even have the impact simulation on your CCF and PCFs. That is where you are at today. Then quantifying the impact. I'll also come back to later. How much emissions can be reduced? What reduction levers do you have to reduce Scope 3 emissions? Changing transport modes, changing transport optimization, sourcing more sustainable, and then realized because some things take time, not the full emissions reduction can be accounted for this year. How does this tie into my timeline of CCF reduction of my reduction targets? Then cost, obviously, your businesses, there are many different industries here today. The cost of certain measures is very dependent on how your business is made up, how your supply chain is made up. It might have a capital expense cost, it might have price premiums associated with it. That you will have to translate to your operating expense impact as a company. You will also need to be able to calculate cost per ton abated if you want to really, when we come back to this reduction planning, really prioritize certain projects over each other. And then 4 and 5, risk and feasibility and strategic value are very core components to a business case, but I'll briefly touch on supplier maturity because recent risk and feasibility and strategic value are very supply chain and customer base specific. For example, this risk of execution is vastly different if you have suppliers in Europe or in China or in Africa or in different continents, maybe even in different industries. The operational trade-offs is information your procurement team has, which your commercial teams might have. These are things or elements from the business case that only you from within the business can really derive. And strategic value is another one, because here are like the 5 main categories we come across as what is the strategic value of Scope 3 reduction. Obviously, the main one is saving the planet, but when we're talking about business cases, it often has to be tied to monetary value, to return, to quantifiable return. So it often comes back to what is reduction leverage. For certain customers, how big of a footprint, how big is your product impacting their footprint, for example, their CCF, their PCF, their targets? Can you score that for your customers, which commitments they have made and how large your impact is on their footprints? Tender advantage. For example, more and more companies are installing procurement requirements that you have to report, that you have to supply a certain level of carbon detail when it comes to your PCFs, for examples. A good example is CO2 performance ladder, where government issued contracts often have requirements when it comes to sustainability. Then there's also the cost of inaction. Now, reported emissions of purchased traditional products can go up because of credits mass balance. Obviously, as more companies or suppliers of certain goods start creating sustainable products, they create credit systems, so the reduction can only be attributed to the company purchasing the sustainable products. But that means that the mass balance of everything that is left might go up in reported emissions, not in actual emissions, but because of mass balance, the reported emissions might increase over time. The cost of sustainable products will go up as demand increases. Targets have been set, and okay, they might have been voluntary to some degree. More and more legislation is pushing for reduction. The costs, certain implicit costs, will keep rising. So demand as such will increase. How fast it will increase, that is debatable, but the demand will increase. So the cost of sustainable goods might be cheaper now, depending on in the future. But also it depends. For example, in agricultural products, it's also good to think about, was it a good harvest? Was it a bad harvest? To really tie in your sustainable purchasing related to the reality of the market. And then replacement costs when supply chains get disrupted. This is this is an aspect of risk assessment. How exposed are you to supply chain disruptions? Do you source from other continents, and can logistics chains be interrupted because of hurricanes, because of droughts, because of extreme weather effects? Because if you then have to source from somewhere else, the markup is going to be a lot more. And then the last two, but these are less frequent today, with regards to the companies we talk to, but carbon tax exposure in your supply chain. The main ones we come across is fertilizer, aluminium, and cement. People who are sourcing this from China and Africa are already simulating Scope 3, let's say, optimizations by getting production here because of these import taxes. But it's less prevalent, even because CBAM is only really into effect from this year onwards. And ATS is across the board for everybody who uses energy. And then the reputational value of setting and meeting targets. This is more abstract. I've added it here. It's important if it's important for your customers, if it's important to your buyers, and how you can leverage to sell, but it's not always equally relevant for everybody. So defining the strategic value, core component of the business case, but is very specific to your business and your understanding of your supply chain and your customers. So how do I go about getting the data to start my business case, to support my business case when I want to convince leadership, CFO, maybe other stakeholders within the company? Now at Climate Camp, we run through a 4-step process. A lot of other solution providers or consultants might have something similar. The basis is, well, first you start with carbon accounting. Today, we're not really going to focus on that because the companies here today, you already did a spend-based analysis, you already have CCF, you already have reduction targets. This is for the not so mature companies, the smaller suppliers, the SMEs, they are still working on this step 1. Whereas if you want to really create a business case, we're really talking about step 2 and step 3. Step 2 being supplier engagement, getting the PCF data, the primary data, or intensity-based CCF to do a comparison, to see what is the data quality of my hotspots and what is possible when it comes to Scope 3 reduction. And then the last one, and then the step 3, Scope 3 reduction. Well, now you have the primary data. Now can you measure what the impact might be of certain Scope 3 projects? Let's say for sourcing different products, for example, switching renewable energy share from your suppliers, for example, switching transportation routes, improving quality checks, moving production sites. All these elements relate to measuring and simulating Scope 3 projects, and will be vital to creating a business case. If you cannot say how much you reduce and over what timeline, at what costs, there is no business case to begin with. And then step 4, I'm not going to really focus on it today in this webinar, but then you also, if you have reduction or if you have Scope 3 reduction and you want to translate that towards more sales, you need to be able to sell that shared reduction or sell that potential for reduction to your customers. With these investments, my PCF will go from here to here, which will impact your CCF in this manner, which is then a step towards selling sustainability. Now, let's talk about supplier engagement, where you start to have high quality data. Now, very simply, I think a lot of you have already done this, so I'm going to gloss over it a little bit more high level. But just start out with identifying your material categories within your scope 3, within purchase goods and services, within up and downstream transport, use of sold products. And then you find the suppliers responsible for 80% of emissions per category. So that you have a quick view, let me just show you in ClimateCamp, for example. Here we have the emission group recycled paper. In recycled paper, I want to see who are my main suppliers, and I can see these 3-4 suppliers, for example, represent almost 70 to 80% of my footprints for this specific product. So in this case, recycled paper, for example. But do I want to show actual, because sometimes you purchase multiple products from multiple suppliers, so you also want to be able to showcase for your suppliers what is their total impact on your total footprint, so you can just assume, okay, the combination of these 4, for example, will already cover 80% of my emissions. So after we have identified 80% suppliers responsible for 80%, we need to collect the primary data through supplier engagement. We're talking about CCF, targets, PCFs, and we're also talking about validation calls. A part of this can be done automatically. A part of this can be done through validating, or has to be done through validating the data. Now, I will show you this a little bit later, but there are 2 cases. What happens, they either have primary data or they don't. If they do have it, it needs to be validated, because we've worked with Chinese companies, for example, having the right documentation so you are sure that the numbers are reputable and you can use them is really important if you want to actually simulate and prove scope 3 reduction. But what you also have is some suppliers lack primary data. Then you can help these suppliers calculate their emissions. We have seen multiple projects where PCF calculations are done with suppliers. On one hand, because they are material to their footprints. On the other hand, because it gives you more detailed insights to reduction levers. For example, the increasing renewable energy share. If you calculate PCFs for a bunch of your suppliers, you have an idea of the components, energy within their production step. Then you can simulate for these 4 or 5 companies what will happen if they change from energy they get or electricity they get from a coal plant versus laying solar panels on their factory in Indonesia, for example. So when we're talking to suppliers, we've defined who we are going to talk to. I quickly wanted to stand still with this quote. It's one of our customers. He said, GG accounting is always an iterative process when you're looking to improve what you have calculated previously. The reason why I'm paraphrasing this here is because it takes time for your suppliers to build up reporting capabilities, meaning it might take years before you receive high quality PCF data from suppliers you can integrate. When people ask us, why should I start with scope 3 now while we still have time, or why now? We are still busy with, let's say, laying solar panels or switching to electric cars. One of the arguments I always talk about is, well, it will take time until you actually even have the data to start building the business cases, to having the depth and understanding of what is possible on scope 3 reduction. You need to define the data points to gather. Now, what we always say is you increase data granularity over time. Make a plan for what we want to ask this year, next year, and the year after that. Because a part of outreach will trigger at your supplier the idea that this is important to you. So they will invest time in calculating it, maybe doing a PCF calculation, maybe doing CCF calculation, maybe providing better documentation. So you can have certain requirements in the first year and then make them more stringent as years pass. So what we see, for example, in the first year, often companies focus on getting weight and distance information if they don't have it already, so they can transform the material categories to activity weight-based or activity distance-based. And then already start collecting PCFs for those who have it, or CCF and target information for those who have it as well, especially if these suppliers are within their material categories. Well, this then signals this is important to me as your customer. So in the second year, you might be able to go a step further. For your top suppliers, you might be able to ask how much recycled content are you using? What are the material types that you are using? What are the PCF breakdowns? What are the different production steps in your product and how much emissions are generated during these steps? And then already the companies who didn't have PCFs last year might have them this year, who then also need to be validated and documented. Then you start to have CCF targets for everyone. Why CCF targets important in this supplier engagement story? You cannot use CCF intensity as a metric to integrate within your Scope 3 reduction, but it's a good way to measure how are they doing and how are they competing versus other players in the markets. You cannot integrate it yet, but it gives you an idea of how are they performing. Obviously, CCF intensity has a lot of gaps. What are they reporting on? Which categories are covered, not covered? It gives you an idea. It gives you a certain line, a certain segmentation, but you are not able to use it as a quantifiable data. Why is supplier engagement hard? Not only because you need to define all these data points, all these different, not only carbon data points, but product data points, but you also need to validate it. Why validate it? What we often see in Europe, it's quite fine, but in other continents, how reputable are the numbers? So how much do they differ from the industry emission factor? For example, is it reasonable, this difference versus the emission factor, or maybe versus PCF from another supplier? These are the steps that your procurement team is not always equipped to execute on, because they need the context, they need access to information about emission factors to understand, is this PCF actually usable or not? Now, tips and tricks for supplier engagement. Why don't we just do this internally? I wanted to pose this question here because we hear it a lot, and you should always do supplier engagement internally. For many of our larger customers, the procurement person, or especially for the largest accounts at their procurement, within their procurement team, they start doing it internally. But when you start out with Scope 3 and Scope 3 business cases, your procurement professionals are not trained to accurately validate CCF and PCF data. It takes understanding of sustainability, of GG accounting, to ask the right questions, to integrate it, embed it in current processes. It's not a switch you can flip and say, okay, tomorrow my procurement professionals are able to gather and validate this information. They will also often be talking to the wrong person, because the salesperson on the other side, if he's lucky, he has a PCF report, but more often than not, he will call or mail his sustainability person, who then needs to be roped in. And all of this, gathering and processing CCF, PCF, and target data for integration and simulation, takes a lot of manual work. And that is one of the main reasons why working together with a partner is valuable, or finding a system or a way of working that optimizes this work, because all the time you spend on collecting and validating this information is time taking away from actual working on reduction levers. And it all boils down to this: sustainability becomes a bottleneck because you need to be present in every procurement conversation to ask the right questions if they are not trained properly or don't understand the subject matter enough. You need to be present in every sales conversation to clarify, what is this PCF? How does it compete versus other products? What are we doing to improve this PCF, for example? And even other sustainability metrics like water usage, recycled content, and more, which makes it that the amount of sustainability people you have is the bottleneck for performing or achieving on Scope 3 reduction. The last one is supplier enablement. As I said before, if they don't have the right data, you need to calculate it for them. For example, a lot of other continents might not already have carbon accounting to the degree that Europe has. Helping suppliers to calculate PCFs, well, it serves the purpose of increasing primary data share, but it also serves the purpose of understanding what is driving their emissions. I'll show a bit later the impact on CCF and PCF. Now it's a bunch of slides to give you the general storyline of how you get to the data. Afterwards, I'm going to show how we integrate that data with ClimateCamp. The last thing for supplier engagement I wanted to focus on is tracking supplier maturity. As I mentioned before, you collect CCF and supplier, and if they have targets or not. If they have targets or not, it's because it's maybe relevant for your supplier engagement targets from SBTI. But tracking maturity is also something, a way you can enable your suppliers to perform better over time. Because the numbers is, okay, they calculate the PCF, do they have the capabilities to deliver certain carbon data points, is something you want to track, not merely is the number they deliver us correct. The reality is that some things take time and you need to help your suppliers increase this maturity over time. So tracking CCF, tracking targets, tracking CCF intensity is a good measuring stick to see how are they doing and how are they progressing versus last year, for example. So this helps to work together with your suppliers. It gives your procurement team, for example, insights into how are my suppliers already performing. But PCF is actually the basis for integrating the data. And then we go towards reduce scope 3, where you actually measure projects. Now, I'm going to show it in ClimateCamp in a couple of minutes, but basically it comes down to this graph or this couple of steps. You either measure because you already do some scope 3 projects, and then you are able to change industry average emission factor into the supplier-specific emission factor. Let's say you source different or more sustainable goods, for example. You change activities, upstream transport, for example. You change transportation modes, see the effect of that. And you always want to see it on two fronts. You want to see it on how does this impact your corporate carbon footprint and how does this impact your product carbon footprint. Product carbon footprint because you can then sell it as a more sustainable version. Corporate carbon footprint to see if you are meeting your reduction targets. Measure has to do with what you're already doing. Simulate obviously has to do with what is the potential for reduction, what are the reduction levers I have. Certain reduction actions, let's source lower carbon products, is something you can easily do if you have access to the information like PCF information, for example. But if you really want to dive into what happens if I switch my suppliers to renewable energy, for example, you need much more detailed PCFs insights, or you need a more detailed PCF breakdown. So let's take a look at how we do it in ClimateCamp. So when we calculate activities, for example, here we have purchased goods and services. This is for, I think it's a packaging company. Obviously, in reality, this is hundreds of thousands of lines, probably. So if I want to see what is the impact, I have already, for this, for example, glue, I have already engaged or collected PCF data from one of my suppliers. So for example, Afreen's Café, in this example, I collected product footprints of. I can also see for these product footprints, for example, if they have, I think it's sustainable glue, if I correctly, sustainable glue, if they have more detailed documentation according to which ISO standards were they calculated, which system boundary was applied. So you can check the validity, you can easily check the documentation related to PCFs. But if you want to build your business case, you actually want to see, okay, what is the effect of switching to lower carbon goods for my CCF? For example, we see, okay, the total reporting period 2024 is 663 tons. And purchased goods and services, almost 1/3 of it is 210 tons. Now, if we look towards glue, for example, if we were going to switch this to a PCF, let's see, emission factors. I think they are both. I'll show it on one example. It will be easier to show like this. For example, here, let's load in the emission factors. You can see there is a glue pressure sensitive adhesive. I think it's from EcoEvent. I'm not quite sure where the emission factor comes from. And now we can see, okay, I've already connected with Afreen's Café here. That's my supplier. What PCF does she have available? Sustainable glue. So I can compare the CO2e impact of this sustainable glue versus the glue that normally comes from the industry average emission factor. Now, if we recalculate, we saw that it was about 41,000. So here you can see it. The total for this activity line is 37,200 when using sustainable glue. If we just use the industry average emission factor, it's 41,000 kilograms, 150. So a difference of about 4 tons. So if we recalculate this, we will see from 210 it went to 206, but it's not the only glue. I can also do this in bulk, but let's do it one by one. For example, I also have another glue where I can see, okay, if I change it here, I can see another 1.5 tons can be saved. So the impact here, and I'll go back to the presentation, the impact here is how we can abate 6 tons of CO2e equivalents per year. We see the PCF versus this from this normal glue versus the sustainable glue. It was 3.1, my apologies. And we purchased 12,000 kilos, which relates to 6 tons abated per year, which is, if you can see properly, 6 tons out of this is about 1% of my total CCF. So if I'm reducing 25%, 25% scope 3 over 5 years, that's already 5% of my scope 3 reduction, which is required. Now the cost, I've added here a price premium of 20 cents per kilo. This is how you start building your business case. Now this is very simplistic because it's just one activity line or 2 activity lines. Obviously you want to showcase this on 100 activity lines or maybe a large volume or quantity purchased. But this is just to make it a simple example of, okay, this is the impact that it will have or possible impact it will have to have different sourcing. Then the risk and feasibility and strategic value is, as I mentioned before, this 1% reduction of your total CCF means 5% of your scope 3 reduction target. The second one, translating this reduction to your product, places you as one of the most sustainable products. Let me go to an example of PCF calculation, for example. So we'll go here. Voila. We have 2 drinks, CarboSoft, 330 milliliters, SustainaSoft, 330 milliliters. This is on a production volume of 50,000 liters because many of the PCF calculations we do is on a certain production batch, not correlated back to a single can. But if you want to do it, you would have to divide 20 tons by 50,000 liters and then like by 150,000 because it's 330 milliliters. Here we made 2 separate PCFs where the difference is, okay, for the CarboSoft, we just use electricity from grids, which generates here, you can see all these emissions, for example, it's about 300, it's about half a ton, 500, 600 kilograms of CO2. Whereas the SustainaSoft, it has 0 scope 2 emissions and it just has some fair emissions because it comes from the renewable energy. All right, that is already a difference. Our one can is made with renewable energy, the other is made with traditional grid mix. But we also want to supplant the raw materials, for example, because citric acid in this example is also sourced from one of my suppliers. For example, here, the industry average emission factor was citronzuur, which was 2.4, whereas here the CO2 emission factor is citric acid from one of my suppliers. Yes, these are extreme examples. It's just to showcase it a little bit more in this demo. In reality, it's more related to the example I gave before, a couple of hundreds of difference, a couple of tens of difference. But when we're talking about volumes of 10,000 kilos, 100,000 kilos, multiple millions of kilos and tons, the impact becomes rather large, even if the PCF value is minute. But here you can see the difference on the PCF level for CarboSoft versus SustainaSoft is 20 tons versus 18.24. If you then divide it by 150,000, you know the impact per. Yeah. That is how we showcase impact. That's how you get through the numbers. This is the amount of emissions we abated per year. This is the impact on your total CCF because you can easily, let me just do this here, because you can easily see what is the impact on my total 2024 footprint or the impact on my product carbon footprint. That will give you the data to build or start building this data-backed scope 3 business case. Now, building the case, getting the baseline, getting the impact, the cost is something related to your business, the risk and feasibility tracking, these are all levers to effectuate scope 3 reduction. But visualizing and making a project plan is also the final aspect of it. Not just, I know the cost now, I know the tons abated, I know the PCF values. So what does this look like when we're looking at different reduction measures? I'm just going to quickly have to go here. A little bit further. All right, here, marginal cost abatement curves. Once you know how much tons you can abate with certain measures, what the cost is related to certain measures, you can build your marginal cost to show, okay, what is the cost efficiency impact of certain measures, but also how much tons of CO2 can they abate. So you can actually build a prioritization matrix based on these examples. Like, for example, here I divided scope 1, 2, and 3 measures, where you can easily see, obviously this electric cars and solar panels, it creates an energy cost reduction, which means it actually saves you costs, which makes it a negative euro per ton cost or like indication. But as you can start scope 3, the reduction capabilities are much larger, they're much broader because they can abate much more CO2 emissions. Using this marginal cost abatement curve is a good way to visualize the impact. The surface area of these blocks is the impact it can have. The height will show how much the cost efficiency is. This is a good tool to leverage versus your leadership or versus finance what the impact of certain measures is. And over time, you might do electric cars first, you might do solar panels on site first, but you will slowly start moving to the right side of certain measures. For people who want to make marginal cost abatement curves, I've made a link here, which makes it easy for you to make your own curves, because Excel, for example, doesn't allow variable width when you want to make this for your business case. The impact versus cost effectiveness, it's the same principle. I'll also send an Excel with it so you can use or regenerate these graphs if you want to build your own business case. But this is the same, but it's a more contextualized graph of the marginal cost abatement curve. It's just showing how much does it actually cost certain measures and what is the tons of CO2 emissions abated. But the last one, and I think this is also very relevant, is the stacked cumulative reduction. You will have multiple measures and they will not always reduce all the emissions in 1 year. So you need to build a timeline. Let's say here, what is it, 211,000? Okay, 211,000 is the target we've set of total emissions we need to reduce. Then you need to stack different measures to see, okay, between now and 2034, for example, how will I reach this reduction and how does this play into year over year reducing our carbon footprint? So stacked cumulative reduction, marginal cost abatement curves, all these I will send to you after the webinar has been concluded, if you want more information with regards to this. Now, there's also a short Q&A section. I didn't mention it at the start of the webinar. Normally, I do it. Are there any questions related to building a business case? I also maybe want to know if there are people here, what are the challenges you are facing when making a business case? Is it finding the data? Is it working with suppliers? Is it increasing the supplier maturity? If there are any questions, please do post them. There is a Q&A section on top or on the right side. I think there is also a chat. So I'll leave maybe a minute or two for people if there are certain questions related to building a data-backed business case, or if there are questions related to ClimateCamp. So far, it's only the AI assistants having a conversation in the chat. I'll wait a couple of seconds more, but then I'll be closing the webinar. Okay. Verena has a specific question. How about if you don't have clear hotspots, supplier categories, and scope 3, where to start if it all has a small impact? That, depending on obviously what the distribution is of your hotspots, Obviously, if there is some distinction, go for the large categories, but already doing this hotspot mapping and then coming to the conclusion they are all equal, then it's just about where do you think contextually you will have the biggest impact. Maybe you are a large customer to the supplier. Maybe you know for these products there is a lot of optimization possible. Maybe you know that you are sourcing from far away, so that there is a lot of potential for reduction there. The hotspot gives you an arrow to point, but to understand where to shoot it at, you also need to know the context of their products and your supply chain. To give you an example, Verena, there's a lot of companies who do PCF calculation in the hope that it will already show that they are doing great. This often not, or this sometimes doesn't happen. The PCFs then show the inefficiencies of their supply chain because they route products through certain continents or through certain countries from a cost perspective, but then it will have a major impact on CO2 emissions. Often also you cannot integrate improving data granularity as a reduction. So then when you do this PCF collection, or when you do this PCF collection, you see, my actual CCF goes up. So how about if you don't have clear hotspot supplier categories, pick a couple of categories just to start with, or use contextual information like, we probably assume there's a lot of reduction potential here because of the makeup of the products, because of the distance they travel. A lot of smart decisions can be made just using Occam's razor. What takes a long way to get shipped? What is a very energy intensive product? And start from there. I hope, Verena, that answers your question. Are there any other questions for people who are present here? All right, then as I mentioned before, I will be sending the recording of this webinar to you so you can follow up on it. I will send you the links to make your own marginal cost abatement curves, to make your own impact graphs for reduction planning so you can use it later. Okay. No, another question from Erwin. We work with smart trackers for the CO2 prestation ladder. Is this database a good platform to define your baseline and collect the first data? There are many platforms that are good at defining baseline. When it comes to carbon accounting tools, a lot of carbon accounting tools focus on the carbon accounting aspect of it. So they're good at making a spend-based assessment. Maybe they are also good at doing activity-based allocation. We have some customers who used to work with smart trackers. So it's a good start. But if you want to integrate supplier-specific data, smart trackers won't help you there. So it will give you a baseline. It will tell you your hotspots probably, but then actually integrating the data or actually collecting and validating the data, they will not do. So that is then a process that you need to handle yourself, Erwin, or have a system for it at your company. But for a baseline and getting your hotspots, there are multiple good tools to use. You're welcome, Erwin. And I think if that was the final question, then I'll be closing the webinar here. Thank you, everybody, for being present. If you have any questions which were unanswered, please let them know or let me know. I would love to make a webinar on that topic. See you and goodbye.